May the 25th, 1940. The situation of the British Expeditionary Force and the French First Army was desperate. The port of Boulogne had been overrun. German troops had isolated Calais. The British were being forced back to the port of Dunkirk. Lord Gort, the British commander, advised his government that the only hope of saving even a fraction of his troops was to organize an evacuation by sea. But as the dive bombers screamed down and the panzers were poised for the final assault, evacuation seemed a forlorn hope. The British anticipated that Dunkirk would be overrun within a day. But unknown to the British, Hitler and the German High Command had made a decision which was to save them from total annihilation. The Germans were only too aware that their panzer crews were exhausted and their machines needed urgent repairs. Those attacks by de Gaulle and the British may have failed, but they have shown very clearly how vulnerable the German lines of communication were. This was the great weakness of blitzkrieg. So the High Command made a fateful decision. It decided to stop the panzers' advance to save them from further damage and wait for the infantry to come up. Only then would the Allied pocket around Dunkirk be eliminated. So the blitzkrieg was halted and the panzers lay idle. They would not advance for 2 days, just enough to buy the British in particular a little time to prepare. As the tanks waited, the only major action was in Calais. There the British and French garrison refused to surrender. Instead, they had to be overrun in 3 days of bloody hand-to-hand fighting. When the panzers got going again 2 days later on May the 26th, the weather had changed. The Germans became bogged down in the heavy rain, again giving the Allies more time. So it was that at 7:57 p.m. on May the 26th, Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, flag officer commanding Dover, received a signal that he was to put Operation Dynamo into action. Operation Dynamo was a plan to withdraw the British Expeditionary Force by sea. He had prepared it more in hope than expectation that it could ever be used. The following day, a makeshift fleet of destroyers, tugs, and passenger ferries crossed the English Channel. But by the end of the day, less than 8,000 of the over 300,000 troops at Dunkirk had been rescued. The port was under such heavy air attack that it could not be used. And the ships could not get in close enough to the beaches. So Ramsay now sent out a call for any boats of shallow draft that were over 30 feet long. Hundreds of cabin cruisers, fishing boats and barges were gathered from harbours all over southern England and sent across the Channel, often crewed by their civilian owners. The little ships worked on the beaches of Dunkirk, ferrying troops out to the larger boats, waiting to take them to safety. All the time, they were under constant air attack. The British Air Force threw every fighter it possessed into the battle to drive the Luftwaffe off. Even so, 7 French and 6 British destroyers were sunk, together with 24 smaller warships. A quarter of the 665 small boats never got home. But when the evacuation was halted on June the 4th, over 300,000 men, 41% of them French, had been rescued. None of this would have been possible without the heroism of the French army. It played a vital role in slowing down the German advance. The French rearguard didn't leave its positions around Dunkirk until the last boats had pulled away from the beaches. One British officer compared them to the last stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae. Even so, the British army had lost most of its heavy weapons. It wouldn't be fit to fight the Germans again for a long time. France still had to fight on, but it had lost more than half its army. Against them, the Germans had 92 divisions, including masses of armor. At 4 in the morning of June the 5th, a short bombardment began the final destruction of France. Assault troops crossed the Somme and the Aisne. At first, the French resistance was fierce, and the Germans struggled to break out of their bridgeheads. But, once again, the Luftwaffe helped crush the defenses. Soon the panzers were pushing south, and the trickle of surrendering French troops turned into a flood. By the 9th, the panzers had reached the River Seine, and the infantry were only a few hours behind. Once across the river, the Germans fanned out into the interior of the country. On the 14th, the German army marched into Paris. The swastika was raised on the Eiffel Tower. Hitler had secured the prize which had eluded the Kaiser in 1914. The Parisians could only watch in stunned horror. Throughout the period of the French collapse, Winston Churchill paid 5 visits to France, trying to bolster French resistance. On June the 16th, he even offered Paul Reynaud a union with Britain if France stayed in the fight. But it was too late. Reynaud's cabinet rejected the proposal, and the Prime Minister resigned that evening. He was succeeded by Marshal Philippe Pétain, who immediately asked the Germans for an armistice. It was only now that the Germans finally began to attack the Maginot Line, which had been left isolated. After a heavy artillery bombardment, the French defenders offered only token resistance before the German troops occupied the forts. On June the 21st, Hitler went to Compiègne, where the railway carriage in which the Germans had signed the armistice in 1918 was kept. As a French delegation entered the carriage, he handed them his terms and then left. The French insisted on consulting their government, but the next day they were told that if they didn't sign immediately, the panzers would roll again. They signed, and the humiliation of France was complete. For Hitler, his control of Western Europe seemed absolute. He felt sure that Britain must now seek peace, and that soon he could turn to the next stage of his master plan. But even though the Blitzkrieg had achieved so much so fast, it hadn't won him the war. The British, battered and wounded, had escaped to fight another day.